Now we'll turn to some private sector perspectives. May I invite Jim to say a few words?
Good afternoon, everyone. I think this initiative of One Belt, One Road is transformational, or can be transformational, for Sri Lanka if we allow it to be. In fact, the relationship with China isn't new. As we all know, it's been a key partner in many different ways for a very long time. What's new is the pace is picking up. You've got the Port City, which is a massive project that will go on for the next 20 years or plus. Now the Hambantota port is finally getting going. All these things have tremendous amounts of additional opportunities for the private sector to become involved, get involved in participating in certain constructions, designing certain buildings, participating in free trade zones and manufacturing facilities, etc. There's all sorts of things here that I think are positive about this, and I think it also, as our speakers yesterday morning spoke, this is a catalyst, one important catalyst that could help fuel the levels of Sri Lanka's own competitiveness, its own ease of doing business. It'll be incentives to improve the overall environment for everyone. The domestic market, obviously the international market, we all know that exports are not trending up, and so this could be a catalyst to boost a significant amount of additional exports, not just to the key markets of the West, but back into the East, and produce and assemble and do things for different consumers. So I think that this initiative is a very important one, and particularly for Sri Lanka, who right now is in need of additional foreign direct investment. It's not able to fund as much government-to-government things anymore, so public-private partnerships are actually perfect for its continued growth and development. So I just see so many ways that this can play a very important role in the growth and development of Sri Lanka, in the growth and development of the reasons why we all have so much confidence and are so bullish on Sri Lanka's future. So I see this as an enabler. I see this as a catalyst. I see this as something that you should embrace, obviously, carefully and with your eyes wide open, all that sort of thing. But this is not new. Let's look at ways to bring in all the aspects of society, all the elements of policy making and good governance, and have this really push the growth and development of Sri Lanka and the realization of its true potential forward. I just think there's a wonderful opportunity.
Thank you, Jim, and for saving us several minutes. Vish?
Okay. Well then, can someone tell me what's the cricket match right now? Anybody know?
Thanks. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am pretty much, speaking last. Everything that has to be said is already said, but I will comment basically on this OBR-OR initiative is going to go through. Unlike the TPP initiative that got politically derailed, I think the political will on China's part is very strong, and I think it will go through. And unlike our neighbors, I don't think we have a lot of choice on whether we are going to participate in this or not. I think we will have to participate. It brings lots of positives and negatives. We will have to be ready. I think my real question here is Sri Lanka ready to take part in this initiative? I think China has done its part by making the large investments already. From 2013, the initiative has started. You can see the type of investments China has made in Sri Lanka so that this initiative will go through. But has Sri Lanka made its investments to make sure that we can take part? For example, we talked about trade packages to be given to our companies which can't handle through these FTAs, etc. Is it just lip service, or is it going to happen? We talked about yesterday in retraining and skill development, etc., for our people who will get displaced through these programs. Again, have we started it? Are we still only talking about it? So it's about being prepared and being ready once this initiative starts, and you can see the type of investments that China has made. It's a 8 trillion, I heard Dr. Wea say that. They've already committed to 1.3 trillion of this money in this program. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a bullet train that's coming, and I think we are sitting on a steam engine track. I don't know how we are going to take this, but I think we have to really double up and do whatever it takes. I have been part of, as an observer of the FTA between Sri Lanka and China. Some of the issues that come up is the language. Language is a huge barrier. We should be having 10, 20 people in China learning the language, learning how to read documents, etc. I don't think we are doing all that. We are negotiating an FTA without being prepared on what are the things that will come after it. So those are my real concerns, while all the political and geographical and all the other issues that has been discussed. As for trade, we, Sri Lankan businesses and the Sri Lankan government has to double up and be ready, or we will be left out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we get to the more exciting part, is to ask a few questions. And I'm going to try to ask things that have come from the floor and things that I think are of interest to the Sri Lankan audience as one reads the papers and listens to the chatter in Tamil, in Sinhalese, in English. So let me start with Wen. Does Sri Lanka's participation in the Belt and Road Initiative also mean a military presence of China in Sri Lanka?
Yes, I understand that's the concerns of many people, and but I think the answer is quite simple. It's no. As I mentioned in my presentation, now China has the problem of over-dependence on a single trade route, and the trade goes through the Indian Ocean and also the Malacca Strait. And how to solve this dilemma? I think for great power, it has two options. One option is a military solution, and you can sign maybe defense treaty with countries along the routes, and you can build a military base. And the second option will be you build new ports and also new roads to diversify your trade routes. So in this sense, actually, I'm thinking the One Belt One Road is a substitute to the military solution. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
No, thank you. That's really nice. Now, Amithendu is Indian but also Singaporean. So I'm going to pose a question to him on his Indianness. So does India have anything like the One Belt, One Road? And what can India really offer Sri Lanka in terms of infrastructure? And should we bother?
I think this is the first time I'm feeling uncomfortable over the fact that I am an Indian and I work in Singapore. But let me try to explain this in a slightly broader context. There's a very large amount of conversation that's being devoted internationally to the fact that India has probably been the only country that has formally opposed the One Belt, One Road. Now, before coming to why it did and where there is a question of an alternative, let me also point out that if you look back and see a host of other initiatives, and the most prominent initiative that I would like to allude to is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. India is the second largest shareholder in the AIIB, where China is the largest shareholder. And it is a collective of more than 60 countries, likely to become 100 plus over the next 1 to 2 years. India and China work very actively when it comes to the New Development Bank of the BRICS. In fact, the current president of the New Development Bank of BRICS, which is based, headquartered in Shanghai, is an Indian. As we are talking about the Indian position on One Belt, One Road, India and China are jointly submitting a paper at the World Trade Organization on how to tackle firm subsidies by on agriculture given by major agricultural exporters from the developed world. So The point that I want to take up here is that why does One Belt, One Road have an objection from India? And that is purely because of a territorial concern. And that territorial concern, as I think is clearly accepted, is non-negotiable. If this territorial concern was not there, then India might not have had any objections to the One Belt, One Road. And having said that, the channels of dialogue and communication are already open. Coming to Ganesh's specific question, Ganesh, you mentioned whether there are any counter-strategic responses. You see, I mentioned this in the last point that I raised over here. I don't know whether one should allude it to a counter-strategic response or an alternative, but the fact of the matter is that on a number of occasions, including in the latest Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Indian Prime Minister Mr. Modi mentioned that India is a distinctly pro-connectivity country. Now, if it is a pro-connectivity country, there is no surprise in the fact if it posits connectivity options and solutions or schemes from its own side, because I think India is increasingly beginning to assume a role of an active player in regional connectivity schemes. Dr. Wen mentioned to Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar in her presentation, so which means that India is a part of regional connectivity initiatives. There are other initiatives like India, Myanmar, Thailand, IMT, in which India has been involved. And to cut a long story short, I think when one looks at initiatives like the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, for example, I don't know whether one should describe it as a counter-strategic response, but well, that's certainly a response. And frankly, I don't see anything wrong in an alternative, because all it means is the supply of public goods providing infrastructure goes up in a heap. So whether China takes the lead in pushing One Belt, One Road, India takes the lead in pushing another initiative, Japan takes the lead in pushing another initiative, who benefits at the end of it? When again mentioned to the ADB report, talking about the deficit in infrastructure and the funding required. So if there are emerging markets from the region coming together and competing with each other and giving infrastructure solutions, good for the region, good for the continent. I'm all for it.
Thank you very much. Nihal wanted to jump in, so I'm going to give him a word.
No, I'm just walking in quietly. I don't want to jump in. This is really about the whole question of the Belt and Road Forum and so on. And the fact that there was a major meeting, the leaders roundtable of the Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation, it's a long thing, in Beijing. And this was in, I think, last month, sorry, in May. And in that communique, in which Sri Lanka also participated, a large number of countries were there. And surprising absentees was India and the United States. Of course, the United States at that time, I think the president was rather new to the game, and I'm not quite sure whether he had been sufficiently briefed about what this exactly meant. Because the real international aspect which China was able to succeed was in able to get the United Nations itself and the World Bank and the IMF. All these people are sort of international groups, so they accepted the fact that there is some degree of international worth in this whole initiative. But whether there is any fear, the two countries, very interestingly, who were not present was, of course, India and also the US. The US, again, I think because of the presidents at the moment, things have been, of course, moving very fast. And now that I'm speaking here in this month, I think the President of the United States is much more favorable now to India, to China, having visited the place. And I think I've seen some of his, he answers emails, which is very interesting, very short-liners to very question phrased. And in several of those, he said, no, China is doing pretty well, and I think we can cooperate with them. So it's a matter of change, I think, that is coming there. But the Indian one is still a bit surprising that they were not present there at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Nihal, Rodrigo, for that clarification. I'm going to ask Jim to come back to the private sector issues. And particularly, Jim, do you expect any PPP opportunities in the Belt and Road Initiative, particularly as regards to Sri Lanka, and how might they be financed?
as I said earlier, the previous government-to-government financing, because of the budgetary situation, isn't really in the cards for the time being. Everything will need to be structured. Everything should take place between public and private enterprises. And I think also what we should be aware of is that on any one of these projects, there'll be plenty of other ancillary projects or ancillary efforts that can come up around them that will allow for just pure private sector involvement. It can be domestic private sector, or it can be additional foreign private sector off the flows of the project, off the investment the project makes. So it's a very dynamic, potentially dynamic process that as it gains momentum and spreads itself across different aspects of the economy, can really provide opportunities for many people. So the issue is to, as Vish said, to be prepared for it, to be able to participate and to be aware how to participate. There's going to be a lot of enabling policies and changes, which were alluded to yesterday morning, that'll need. So it's a concert of different issues, but I really think we can expect to see plenty of opportunities. As far as financing is concerned, I don't really think there's much to worry about. Frankly, there's too much money in the world right now chasing too few opportunities. So there will be there's a whole cohort of multilateral, regional, private, all kinds of funds and other things interested in doing good deals. So, and Sri Lanka is perceived favorably in that regard. So it just needs to put the conditions together. And I think we will be able to accomplish them. In fact, if anything, I think we all know there's a bit of a restlessness that things that already we want to get done haven't happened yet. So I think it's actually the opposite. I think there's a desire to get more involved in investing and supporting the many different kinds of needs that this economy has and opportunities. So I'm not too concerned. I'm pretty optimistic about it.
Thank you very much, Jim. Vish, I'm going to ask a question that is often there in the media. In some of these Belt and Road projects, there is Chinese labor. And the question a lot of us have is, can Sri Lankan labor ever match the productivity of Chinese labor? And what should we do to improve labor productivity here?
Good question. I was going to say, I wish I could answer that. But I'll try and give a long answer for a short question. It's I don't know if it's about matching, but let me try to explain. It's the same Sri Lankan labor. If you just look at the neighborhood that we have in the hospitality sector or in the financial services sector, when they go out of Sri Lanka, they outperform. There's no question about their productivity. Even when Dubai was building its tallest tower, there was enough Sri Lankan labor participating in that construction. So if there was a productivity issues, I don't think they would have survived there. I think it's a lot to do with the social, cultural, and maybe it's the island mentality that we have here, and maybe it's the tolerance that we have towards productivity. I think that's the reason that we, look at the number of holidays we enjoy. So where is the question of productivity? I think that's the issue. I don't think person to person, if we put two together at a different location, I'm sure our labor will outperform. But it's something that we have to address. It's something that if we don't, it's going to be a huge issue. So I hope I answered.
Yeah, no, that's great. Sri Lankan labor can be good under certain conditions, absolutely. I'm going back to when one of the other things we read a lot about is Belt and Road projects mean more debt for a country like Sri Lanka and means more Chinese labor because they're all turnkey and it's a very simple thing. You just sign and everything happens. And it happens within the timeline, it happens quickly. Does it mean more debt and does it mean more Chinese labor?
And I think for Chinese corporation to bring in more Chinese employees to Sri Lanka definitely means higher costs. And so if Sri Lanka is able to offer more skilled worker, and I think the Chinese corporation will be happy to employ the Sri Lanka employees. And another on the debt, I'm not an economist, but before I came to Sri Lanka, I read a very interesting comment, and that author compared Hambantota port to Shenzhen. Shenzhen is a city, a major city in China, and also a special economic zone in China. And this is the first city that opened to the foreign investors, and now it turns out to be a huge economic success. But now in Shenzhen, I think nobody is, because it's so successful, so nobody is talking about how much the Shenzhen government spent in infrastructure or the debt issue. And another thing I want to emphasize is, I think China has the capital and also the expertise to build infrastructure. That's good for Sri Lanka. But another thing is, good infrastructure is only a necessary condition for economic success. It is not a sufficient condition. So for Sri Lanka, and if you want Hambantota port or the Colombo port city to be a huge success, and you need other conditions, such as maybe more stable policy or more favorable terms for foreign investors, and more investment on education. So for me, an ideal situation will be China has this Belt and Road Initiative, and also Sri Lanka also has a long-term view on the economic development model or plan. So Sri Lanka can link its own plan to China's initiative, and then Sri Lanka can also make a better judgment on whether the projects that China offer is what you want, and so that we can achieve a win-win situation. And I also want to say a few words on the autonomy issue of small and medium-sized country. I think that's also a concern of many Sri Lankans, and I think I will take Thailand as one example, and Thailand is also a medium-sized country. I think nowadays both China and Japan are building high-speed rail in Thailand. And this competition actually benefits Thailand. And also, I'm thinking China's entering into the game actually offers Sri Lanka more choices, and also the counterweight, which Sri Lanka can use to deal with other major powers, such as US, India, and Japan, EU, and you can try to make better deals with other countries. And Thailand is taking advantage of the competition between China and Japan to acquire loans from China with lower interest rates. So I think that will be a model or template for Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you. On that point, I will ask Amitendra now to put on his Singaporean hat. How is Singapore planning to take advantage of the Belt and Road, and what is the key lesson for Sri Lanka when you look at Singapore's activism towards the Belt and Road?
The first point is, I think that Singapore is one of those countries of the world which is not only small, but it has tried to capitalize on the fact that it is small by being extremely outward oriented. And this is evident from the fact that it has a trade GDP ratio which is more than 450%. The size of its trade is actually more than 450% of its GDP. Now, this means that under no circumstances, and as we have seen from a couple of conversations that we have had in the summit earlier, Singapore has also been extremely active when it comes to free trade agreements and regional trade agreements. So there's no way Singapore would have stayed away from the kind of a grand connectivity plan that the One Belt, One Road is. Let me just allude to the, not to the issues, but to the evolution that might happen in this respect. Again, if we go back to the maritime geography, there were two countries which were major transshipment hubs till some time ago in this whole geography. One was Singapore, the other was Dubai. Colombo has now come up as a major transshipment hub. Now, this obviously means that the quality and the speed with which goods move across the region and across this entire geography is going to hasten. It's going to make a major difference to the abilities of countries like Singapore, locations like Dubai, to handle traffic. And I think the only way these countries and locations can be a part of the game is to participate as actively as they can in the upcoming infrastructure. And Singapore has the advantage of having had excellent ports and airports, which routinely get ranked among the first 2 or 3 across the world. So I think Singapore is looking at this as the next stage for A, upgrading its own infrastructure capacities, and B, also as a prominent investor and a stakeholder, because it's already in conversation on the Belt and Road opportunities that are coming up in different parts of the geography. And I won't be surprised if down the line, we actually see Singaporean companies playing a very prominent role in the projects that take shape through this architecture.
Ambassador, people say working with Chinese officials is very difficult. They ask too many things. It's complicated. What insights can you offer Sri Lankan business from your dealings with Chinese officials at a high level, at a middle level, please?
Well, actually, dealing with China was okay, but they needed, for example, very quick responses. And I remember even dealing with the whole question of Hambantota at one point. They would ask me, when I was in Beijing, okay, now what's this? And then by the time I get back to Colombo and come back with a reply, they sort of got tired of the whole thing. And this was one major thing. For example, they wanted to develop Hambantota as a city also, to really make a point for which shipping can land and rest and so on. And as I mentioned in my words earlier also, the advantages that Colombo provides, Hambantota was not able to do. But Hambantota is still kept as a port that is going to be helped by China. But I think they have now discovered that Colombo is more helpful in that sense because of the infrastructure and so on it provides. It was delayed a bit because there was a fear at the same time by India that Colombo developing as a port might be not very advantageous to Mumbai and so on, purely in an economic sense, and up to a point politically as well. And this is one difficulty we had, and even now, the Colombo port is only now going to get down to the actual details. Although a lot of the financing was being done, there was a fear among some Chinese, and I'm not saying Chinese as a government even, that this might be some means of reducing the value of some of the Chinese connectivity that were there in other parts of Asia.
I'd like to now turn to Jim and Vish on this question of dealing with Chinese business, and both of you have had vast experience of dealing with that. What insights can you offer Sri Lankan business, particularly a small and medium enterprise?
Look, I think many of the principles of dealing with any another nation or another culture apply. You obviously have to have enough empathy to understand the other side, to take the time to appreciate where they're coming from, to attempt to get to the gist of what's important, what's really important for them, what's their key focus, and what are the issues that they want to pay attention to, and that sort of thing. And then find the middle ground, find the approach that can add value to both sides. And it obviously depends on the circumstances, what you're talking about, and everything else. But they're basic, business people like anybody else. And the larger the company, typically the more experienced, the smaller perhaps less. So your approach is gonna have to vary. And depending on your own international experience or your own expertise in what it is you're trying to accomplish. Especially, I think this is true when you start looking into joint ventures, and that's frankly probably a big piece of the future. It's going to be partnerships. And the success of partnerships is oftentimes not about the money, it's not even maybe about the technology, but it's about the way you go about doing things and the amount of attention and respect and everything else. So it's not easy. Each situation will be different. But if it's important, you will need to understand, learn, and hopefully there'll be a reciprocal reaction on the other side. You want to add something?
Yep. And I think Sri Lankans now, in some form or other, we are interacting with Chinese businesses, and I think it's a learning curve. It's about understanding and building those relationships. They're no different from any other businesses in the other parts of the world. But like Ambassador said, they're in a hurry, they're in a rush. They need to know answers. They come back very quickly. We need to respond within time. And their supply chains are very much tuned. We need to be ready to take on that type of situations. So it's about understanding, trusting, learning, understanding their culture, etc. Very important parts in doing business with China.
Just a point tied up with that and the whole question of Colombo, Hambantota and so on was going back a little into the past. Before China became a sort of a major economic concern, its political strength. And this goes back to 1970s when Sri Lanka was going to host the non-aligned summit in Colombo. And we were not particularly well off financially to prepare the sort of infrastructure required, basically even a better airport to take in people coming in, and most important, the conference. And in that situation, the Chinese jumped everybody else and helped us to build, literally a whole lot of it, the Bandaranaike Center for International Relations. So the BMICH became actually what made possible Sri Lanka to host the non-aligned summit in 1976. And that had a major point because it's also tied up with the political aspect that the Bandaranaikas were also some of the earliest people who really saw the value of China. And to that extent, they wanted also even the title to be as Bandaranaike Center for International Relations or whatever it is. And this was another aspect which was very important, more political at that stage. But I think that was a major theme because they also then became observers in the non-aligned movement, which is very interesting because since then, they have been having many discussions with Sri Lanka and others who are in the non-aligned movement on particular international issues and how they could cooperate without getting too entangled in the politics of any particular situation. And I think that is where, in the case of Sri Lanka, they seem to sort of feel that the location and so on would help them. And they actually provided this conference center, which helped them also as an observer to indicate their willingness to cooperate with different countries, with different political systems on economic issues and so on.
I want to ask Wen a question. How is Sri Lanka, country of 22 million people on the tip of India, seen in Beijing as an economic opportunity? That's question number one. Question number two, how does China plan, in the sense that people talk about China as a civilizational society rather than a generational society? China has this long view about the world. And in that context, is the One Belt, One Road a 40-year program, a 100-year program? I wonder if you can give us your thoughts.
The first question is how does China view Sri Lanka or put Sri Lanka under the framework of the initiative? I think as many speakers already mentioned, Sri Lanka enjoyed a very important position, geopolitical position. I think Sri Lanka is a very important hub along the routes of the Silk Road and along the Belt and Road, and also the Colombo port city, and is also a pilot project of the initiative. So in this sense, Sri Lanka is very important for China. And I think for the second question, I think it's the initiative is really a long-term outlook, and actually the thing what I want to say is actually before the initiative, and there is already the trend. I mean, China's corporation, they are going outside China and to invest all over the world. So maybe in the future we will have new names for maybe different plans, but the trend will be, last for decades.
Thank you. Nihal, I wonder if you can tell us how Sri Lanka is seen in Beijing.
This is the other point that when I was going back into this whole question of assisting the BMICH and so on, we can also go into the history of Sri Lanka and the number of Chinese in the past, like Cheng He, Fashion, who were coming into China. Now, for example, even Buddhism and Fashion and the whole role that was played is something that is very interesting. And though I myself am a Christian married to a Buddhist, it was very interesting that when I was in Beijing, we also organized the first World Buddhist Congress in Sri Lanka, because it was something that the Chinese felt that although they were a communist country, that should not be used as something that is sort of tying them up, and that they were open enough to see the value of these. So this was a rather interesting aspect, the non-political aspect that China has had with Sri Lanka. And the economic aspect is only sort of now being developed because of the linkages and so on. But it was rather interesting that these old historical figures like Fashion and so on, and the interest in Buddhism which they had, and this first World Buddhist Congress on Buddhism. So that was interesting. They wanted to show that they are much more than purely an economic or military power, but something that would also like to build up on friendship and so on.
Thank you. In the time we have left, I'm going to ask each of the speakers to take 30 seconds to tell us one actionable point that either Sri Lankan business or the Sri Lankan government should do so that we benefit from China's One Belt, One Road initiative, and we are somehow important to that rather than being left behind along a big initiative that may occur. I wonder if we start with that side. Vish?
I'll narrow it down to one word, and it's called implement. Implement, implement, implement.
Implement the ease of doing business.
And also, small country, big country, relationship can be easier that way.
Trade facilitation. Sri Lanka's advantage is its openness that has to be capitalized through better trade facilitation.
I look forward to Sri Lanka to link up its own outlook on economic development with China's initiative and create more stable and favorable environment for investment, not just from China, but also from India, the US, and Japan, or other countries. Thank you.
We started this session with three big questions. The first was, does the Belt and Road Initiative mean China will replace the US leadership in global aid? The short answer that I took from this panel was not quite yet, but China will be an increasingly important player in both providing official assistance in infrastructure compared to the past, but also in catalyzing additional resources through public-private sector partnerships. And what I took from Jim was that public-private sector partnership resources can be many times the $100 billion of the official money that may come for the Belt and Road. So China is an additional player, and of course India and others, Japan and so on. So we're in a multipolar aid world, which a country like Sri Lanka may want to pay well. That's number one. Number two, will the Belt and Road Initiative benefit Sri Lanka? The qualified answer is yes, there are net benefits. And the net benefits will come from the following types of things. The first is there will be the design of new buildings. There will be the design of new EPZs. There will be public-private sector partnership opportunities. There will be opportunities for Sri Lankan workers, both skilled and unskilled. And there will be macroeconomic benefits as we begin to go forward. So there can be net benefits, but there are also possibly costs. There are some risks that some projects may have some debt. It depends on how we might finance them, and that's in the hands of how we consider that. There are possibilities of our labor not necessarily being used and turnkey labor being brought from outside. Beyond things we've talked about, there are environmental risks, which also may be mitigated through proper environmental standards and things of this type. The last question we had was, how should Sri Lanka maximize the benefits of this initiative while mitigating the risks? And I think the consensus around the panel is that China has come with this amazing initiative, the most exciting large-scale initiative in our lifetime. The other one that was of this scale was the Marshall Plan, which reconstructed Europe and Japan, Germany and Japan after World War II. There's been nothing of this scale in my lifetime. So what does Sri Lanka need to do? One thing I picked up is we have to train our labor. Without properly trained labor who have the productivity, quality standards, and so on, and work ethic, we ain't going to do well, number one. Two, we've got to implement yesterday. Yeah, I pick up. Number three, we've got to facilitate trade. Right? And number four, we have to take a more open look at some of these important things, and we have to look at good practice experiences. So at 4:28, we stop. I hope we've done our justice. Please give a big hand to our panel. Thank you very much.